Not long after the Halloween horrors have ended, a cyclist's gruesome murder leaves her community in shock.
Her head was missing and had been cut off.
This was brutal beyond brutality.
To know that a woman was murdered like that was terrifying for everybody.
Before investigators can identify a suspect, another victim is found.
You have two bicyclists who are killed about 10 months apart in a brutal fashion.
Despite grisly public displays, the killer evades capture for years.
They're looking at pages and pages of potential suspects.
The general theory was our perpetrator was either dead or he'd moved on.
But was the killer merely hiding in plain sight?
He had created this persona, this character that he played in public, called the zombie hunter.
He's right there. He's taunting us. This was truly over-the-top evil.
Yeah, that's possible. I didn't kill anyone.
This is our version of Jack the Ripper.
November 8th, 1992, the week after Halloween in Phoenix, Arizona. For one resident, the season of horror continues.
The Phoenix Police Department received a call from Joe Krakowicki, and Joe indicated that Angela Brasso had gone out for a bike ride that night and she hadn't returned. And this was unlike her.
According to Joe, he and his girlfriend frequently ride the nearby Arizona Canal bike trail, but when she didn't return after more than an hour, he became worried. Fearing she might be injured and stranded on the trail, dispatchers send out officers. They find some alarming evidence near the canal.
You had a certain amount of blood on that bike trail, and then there was a trail that went kind of in a north direction towards a tree, and the blood trail continues on up about 100 feet or so. Some officers walked up a berm area, which was very close to where Angela's apartment and where Joe had made the phone call.
At the end of the trail, they find something even more disturbing.
They discover a headless body. Her head was missing and had been cut off.
We had never had a crime like this. This was brutal beyond brutality.
The responding officer immediately calls for backup.
She's in the nude. The only thing she's wearing is her shoes and socks were left on. There was a deep incision that almost looked like a cross that went from her sternum area all the way down. It looked like the perpetrator tried to actually cut her in half, but was unsuccessful.
The stabbing was brutal in terms of the amount of force rendered onto her body with this blade.
There were also two wounds that were some type of instrument were driven into the area where typically the female reproductive organs are.
It was a vicious murder, like nothing we had ever seen before.
Although fingerprint confirmation could take several days, investigators suspect they've found their missing person.
Everything indicated that that was Miss Brasso. We look at who was around, who was related. Since this was a very savage, close-up murder, typically, sometimes that's done by a perpetrator that knows the victim.
But late at night, on a canal bank with no one around, a lone female is vulnerable. And that could very well have been a crime of opportunity opposed to somebody targeted.
Nobody seemed to know what happened to her. The race was on to try to figure out who did this.
Born and raised in Pennsylvania, Angela Brasso recently moved to Phoenix with her boyfriend, Joe Krakowicki, after graduating from college.
Angela Brasso was beloved. She was a great student. She was extremely friendly. People described her as lively.
They stayed together even though they were separated by entire state during their college years. She had graduated. She moved here with her boyfriend, and they lived together, and they were really excited about their life together.
Angela is a very hardworking, very family-oriented woman. She has this new job. She had flown out to Los Angeles that prior week and put on an extensive IT, information technology training.
After spending so much time apart, Joe and Angela were putting down roots and making the most of their life together, enjoying Phoenix's outdoor lifestyle. The night Angela disappeared, she and Joe were getting ready to celebrate her 22nd birthday.
The sun was starting to set, and this was in November, so it was crisp and cool out, one of the most ideal times to be outside doing activities in Phoenix. She told him, I'll be right back, typical bike ride, and then I'll be home. Angela Brasso never made it home that night.
Just a few hours later, the media has been alerted to a large police presence at the Arizona Canal, where officers have found Angela's decapitated body.
The word got out quickly, and there was a lot of media attention on this particular case.
All of this was extremely grisly. The Arizona Canal was a really popular place to bike, to run, to rollerblade, walk your dog. There was just this sense of fear, as if everybody in Phoenix was petrified for what's going to happen next.
Officers searched the area for any sign of the killer, but whoever it was seems to have fled the scene without detection.
We have so many cameras nowadays, but back then on the canal, there were no cameras. They didn't have witnesses either.
Homicide detectives are called to the scene, and they begin piecing together the evidence to explain what happened.
The stab wound to the back, it penetrated a lung and aorta, and then it caused extensive bleeding. They didn't find defensive wounds, which would indicate that it was swift, a blitz-style attack. She was startled on her bike or got off her bike, and the perpetrator immediately rushed in and drove that knife into her back. It definitely would have rendered her unable to fight. There was definitely injuries that were consistent with being dragged for a considerable distance. It appeared that the victim had been sexually assaulted. There was a lot of clothing strewn about the body that had been cut and torn. That was packaged and sent to the Department of Public Safety crime lab for processing, looking for semen, perpetrator's blood, any kind of hairs, that kind of thing.
Given the level of violence, investigators suspect the perpetrator may have a record.
Investigators looked to see if there were any other cases that were at all related, and they weren't able to find anything that matched that level of beheading in the city of Phoenix and/or the state of Arizona. It was the most horrendous, horrific murder that Phoenix had seen.
Coming up, detectives take a closer look at Angela's boyfriend.
That's when the alarm bells went off with him of, hey, something's wrong.
And a major break in the case rises up from the murky waters.
Police get a call of a head that was found in the canal.
After discovering the decapitated body of Angela Brasso at a violent scene, investigators immediately turned to her friends and loved ones for potential leads.
Investigators learned that Angela was very easy to get along with. There were really no issues with any particular person being an enemy or wanting to cause her harm.
According to her inner circle, the only recent source of conflict in Angela's life was the relationship with her boyfriend, Joe Krakowicki.
There was some suspicion surrounding Joe, and a lot of times they look at a partner first.
There was indication that Angela was not particularly happy with Joe at the time. There were problems, and the relationship was not going forward, and that maybe she was going to look for another apartment and move out.
When detectives reach out to Joe, he immediately agrees to give a statement.
Joe was as shaken as any person that cared about another person would be. Joe was extremely cooperative, sincere. There was a little bit maybe that the relationship was a little bit better than on his side than what Angela had told her friends. But other than that, yeah, Joe was very cooperative. Joe told investigators that he stayed home that night. He'd sometimes gone riding with Angela, but he decided not to because he wanted to make a cake for her birthday. And while she was bike riding, he was making the cake.
When Angela didn't return after an hour, Joe began to worry.
They always watched a show back in the 90s called In Living Color. And every single Sunday night at 8 p.m., they watched that show together. So that's when the alarm bells went off with him. Hey, something's wrong. She's always back by this time. At about 9 o'clock that night, he called the police department to file a missing person to check for Angela. And then a friend of his came over.
When detectives find out who Joe called, alarm bells ring.
Joe had invited a female friend over to assist him in looking for Angela. Strange that, of all people, you would invite another female that really wasn't known to their family and friends. So while Joe was maintained as a strong person of interest, investigators extensively canvassed the canal, stopped people, tried to get as much information, went to the apartment complex, went to neighbors. Did you see anything? Did you hear anything? And that was largely negative.
Searching for any leads, investigators turned back to the crime lab.
So investigators were able to extract a DNA profile from the clothing that was found at the scene, as well as a sexual assault kit.
In 1992, when this crime occurred, CODIS was in its infancy. CODIS is the computerized DNA index system. It's basically a database for DNA.
They knew they had somebody's DNA who was not Angela on Angela's clothes, but they couldn't make a match to whose that was.
But they are able to eliminate a person of interest.
Joe's DNA sample was ruled out compared to the perpetrator's sample, and he was ruled out.
Lacking leads from the physical evidence, police hope something missing from the crime scene might bring in a tip.
The bike that Angela was riding when she went missing was a higher-end mountain bike, and it was specific.
This was a very unique bike. It was a Diamondback purple But it wasn't just purple, it had shades of purple. It's really kind of fluorescent looking and brilliant in color. And it stood out.
Investigators provide a description to patrol officers in the area. If the bike is still out there, it should be easy to spot.
I would be driving around my beat specifically looking at every apartment complex, every school, every shopping center. No matter how small or how big, I would be hitting those bike racks, hoping I get to find this bike and be part of solving this crime. I remember thinking, if you can do this type of crime to the savage nature that he did it, and it's sexually motivated, you're gonna be a weird puppy. You're gonna have a twisted thoughts, and this individual isn't going to go unnoticed. I'd ask, is there some weird guy in the neighborhood that, freaks you out? Sometimes they would give me a name. I would take that name, and I would forward it to a homicide unit.
Phoenix police also open a tip line for the public to assist the investigation.
So about 10 days after Angela's murder, police get a call of a head that was found in the canal. This was about 2 miles south of where Angela had been murdered. It was in a highly populated area next to a mall called Metro Center Mall. Investigators then are dispatched, and it was in fact determined to be Angela's head.
At first glance, it seems the killer discarded her head downriver to make identification more difficult. But closer inspection reveals something peculiar.
Angela's head, it didn't match up. The level of decomposition of the head was not consistent with how long the head could have potentially been in the water.
Because of that, detectives thought possibly whoever did this actually had stored her head in a freezer to preserve it. It was bizarre.
Investigators believe that the perpetrator may have put the head in the canal for a shock value, more shock and awe to the citizens of Phoenix of, look what I've done.
That added a whole new level of fear to the entire community.
It is not at all uncommon in the context of serial offenders to take something with them, some sort of trophy, so that they can go and relive that perverse gratification that he was experiencing.
When the head is found and then that hits the news, that's when you saw the canal bank become a ghost town. People were talking about this crime as if it was already a serial killer. The entire unit was working this case. You've got to find this guy before he does this again.
Unfortunately, investigators are unable to come up with any further leads.
As a patrol officer, every call I go on, I'm looking at my clipboard. Every prowler call, I'm looking to see if the person might have been on a bicycle. So for 10 months, I'm doing that, and I'm not finding any really strong suspect. Nothing that stood out like, oh my God, this is the guy. None. And then sadly, 10 months later, he hit again.
A body was found floating in the canal.
In September 1993, 10 months after Angela Brasso was found decapitated in Phoenix, Arizona, investigators are called to the scene of another gruesome murder.
A cyclist called in another young woman who was found floating in the canal, which happened to be directly across from where Angela's head had been found. Our dive team went into the waters, recovered the female's body, brought her to the shore. It looked like a late teen victim dressed in a turquoise bodysuit meant for a 8 to 10-year-old.
Detectives note several similarities to Angela's case.
There were drag marks. There were definitely abrasions caused from dragging. They also found a stab wound to her left rear side, which is similar to Angela's wound. There was a considerable pooling of blood along the bike path where it looked like the perpetrator had attacked her there. There was also clothing found that was cut, blood-stained. There was a drag trail in blood all the way up towards the tunnel into some vegetation. That was the area where she'd been potentially sexually assaulted, redressed, and then drugged back and dumped in the canal.
This victim wasn't decapitated, but police do find another calling card left by the killer.
There was also carvings in her body that the investigators could see, including a cross. It was very eerie, and I'm sure the perpetrator was trying to send a message. Good detectives never jump to conclusions. Now, with that said, you have two females who are killed about 10 months apart in a brutal fashion. The head was found floating close to where this victim was found. So you definitely have some things circumstantially pointing you towards, hey, this is the same guy.
Cross-checking police reports, the victim matches the description of 17-year-old Melanie Burness, who was reported missing by her mother the night before.
Once we had determined for sure that it was Melanie Burness and talked to her mother, the family was destroyed by the news. Melanie was extremely bright. She was I believe, a junior in high school, had the world in front of her.
Melanie and I worked together all summer long at the ice cream shop at the Galleria Mall, and we hung out daily. Melanie was pretty reserved and quiet, but then once you got to know her, she was very spontaneous and adventurous. She'd come up with some creative ideas like, let's go to Sedona, or let's drive here. While she did know a lot of people and had multiple friends, I would say her circle of trust, her close group, was probably much smaller.
Melanie had been with her mother the night prior. They had been at their home, and Melanie's mother had gone out for a dinner. And when Melanie's mother returned, she noticed that Melanie was not at the home. She discovered that Melanie's bike was missing, and she figured that Melanie possibly took her bike out. She had really no idea where she went riding.
I knew she loved to bike, and that was a passion of hers. She would bike, miles upon miles, but Melanie would usually ride her bike with her girlfriends, or at least one or two friends. It wasn't common of her to go by herself that often.
The family was asked about the bodysuit, and they said it was way too small. There's no way she would have been wearing that underneath her clothing. The family was able to give it a pretty good description of what she typically wears when she rides, and that was the clothing that was found that was cut off and kind of strewn about the crime scene.
Detectives question why the killer put Melanie in a piece of child's clothing. The answer might prove to be the key to finding a suspect.
A DNA profile was developed from Melanie's clothing and sexual assault kit, and that went into the national database, and there were no hits on that.
Technology isn't advanced enough to definitively confirm a match to the sample from Angela's case.
So they focused on the bodysuit, and they put that out to the media, and they said, does anybody know about this bodysuit? Has anybody seen anybody with this bodysuit? Because it meant something to our perpetrator. So the bodysuit goes out, and it generates even more tips and calls coming in that have to be triaged and vetted out to see, hey, which ones are viable? Do we need to work?
Local media brands the unknown perpetrator as the Canal Killer. further intensifying the community's fear. Unfortunately, none of the incoming tips provide a viable suspect.
I think the department did its best and worked. The investigators were top-notch, and they brought in tons of manpower to work these cases. Unfortunately, as time marches on, other things start to happen to where, sadly, even though investigators work diligently to try to solve these crimes and find the perpetrator, these cases kind of faded as you went through the 90s.
Although the cases remain unsolved, they are not forgotten. 6 years after the initial investigations, developing technology allows detectives to retest their DNA evidence.
In 1999, the DNA system was really had blossomed. The experts had really figured things out.
This time, with more detailed testing capabilities, there is a match. Not with any known criminals, but with the DNA sample collected from Angela Brasso.
We knew at that point that Melanie's killer and Angela's killer were one and the same. That was a major moment because finally, with science, we were able to link those cases.
Unfortunately, the discovery doesn't bring investigators any closer to finding their killer. Another decade goes by with no further movement in the cases.
Be the 10-year anniversary, 15-year anniversary, there would be different attempts to highlight the cases in the media, to draw attention. Really nothing substantially developed. And I think that the general theory was our perpetrator was either dead or he'd moved on.
But in 2011, interest in the murder investigations is rekindled.
In 2008, I had the opportunity to become the cold case homicide sergeant, and we were solving about 12 to 15 cold cases per year. In 2011, I get a public records request.
A local media station is doing a follow-up about the canal killer and wants to know if there are any updates. Detective Hillman takes the opportunity to reopen the cases.
There were files and files in the basement, and there were 800 to 1,000 names on this canal list. And at that point, I knew I needed to assemble a team and give those girls justice.
Coming up, the search for Angela and Melanie's killer gains traction.
So for the first time, using DNA, we could connect with long-lost relatives.
And investigators finally come face to face with a deranged predator.
There was just silence in the room. The hair on the back of my neck stood up.
Years after the murders of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis sent fear rippling through their Arizona community, the haunting tale that began shortly after Halloween 1992 has become a local urban legend. In 2011, a cold case unit led by Detective Troy Hillman reopens the cases and their search for the canal killer.
They're looking at pages and pages of potential suspects or people of interest. So the first goal is let's narrow this list down.
There are certain types, patterns to blood through DNA. You could look at that sequence and then compare those. We, over the course of the next 3.5 years working this case, probably ruled out 25 or more leads.
Unfortunately, they are still unable to come up with any suspects that match the DNA profile. In 2014, a genealogist suggests a different approach.
I went to Phoenix to talk to the police department about applying genealogy to forensic cases, to cold cases. For the first time, using DNA, we could connect with long-lost relatives in the absence of documentation.
The canal killer might not be in the database, but perhaps a member of his family is.
We use the Y DNA because it goes along the male line of the family. If the DNA matched, then you'd know that that was somebody related to you along the male line of your family.
It was worth a shot, so we decided to use her. The DNA sequence was sent over to her in late December of 2014.
I typed those string of numbers into our software, ran the software, and then came up with matches.
I got the call from her, and I was excited, pulled myself away from my Christmas and went in and into the office.
The family name that matches the DNA profile is Miller, with 5 potential suspects.
The first couple really didn't catch my attention, but when I came across Bryan Patrick Miller, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. An anonymous caller called back in 1994 and said that they knew something about the bodysuit that he believed to be the same bodysuit put on Melanie in the possession of Bryan.
It seems police had been so inundated with tips during the original investigation, they'd overlooked this one. When detectives check Miller's background, they discover a criminal record that fits the profile of their killer.
In 1989, Bryan Patrick Miller was a teenager, and he was heading towards an area near Paradise Valley Mall. And according to police reports, he saw a woman who he believed looked like his mom. And Bryan and his mom had had a history of abuse.
He ran up and stabbed the woman in the back. He was later apprehended for that.
The victim escaped, and since Miller was underage, he was sent to juvenile detention. Miller was scheduled to be released on his 18th birthday, but his mother argued against it.
On the day he was supposed to get out, she drops off a letter and says, "I found this in Bryan's bedroom."
That letter was called the plan. And in this piece of paper, Bryan had outlined step by step what he wanted to do to a woman. That included vicious sexual acts against her, graphic descriptions of the kind of sexual things he wanted to do, ultimately killing her.
Well, it was horrific. So I called an emergency team meeting. I said, hey guys, everybody in the conference room, we need to talk about this Miller guy. We handed out the file, and they all got to digest the file. And it was just silence in the room of, whoa, we've been looking for this guy, and this may be him.
Police records show that after his release in 1990, Miller's violent acts weren't limited to Arizona.
Bryan had married a woman in the mid-1990s after our murders, and they had subsequently moved up to the state of Washington. They had a daughter together.
In Washington, there was a woman named Melissa Ruiz Ramirez who was stabbed by Bryan Patrick Miller.
He had picked up Melissa, brought her back to his place of work. She asked to use a phone. She picks up the phone, then he comes up behind her and stabs her multiple times. She is very scrappy. She fights back and survives. He ends up getting arrested for that.
His defense was that she was trying to rob him.
Bryan was acquitted in self-defense. So we know he did it, we know it happened, but he was acquitted in a trial. Because Bryan was not convicted of that, there was no DNA of his entered into the system.
An internet search reveals Miller got divorced in 2006 and returned to Phoenix with his now teenage daughter. And it seems he's picked up some rather unusual interests.
We began to look at social media, get a timeline. Where's he been? Where does he work? Who are his friends, family? We found he was heavily into steampunk and cosplay.
The easiest way to explain steampunk would be, it's almost like a fantasy historical reenactment of the 1800s or Victorian dress. I met Bryan about 2012. He had just come on the steampunk scene and was looking to do something fun and different.
He had created this persona, this character that he played in public called the zombie hunter. He had all of these pictures on his Facebook and a Tumblr page that showed him in this trench coat with these goggles and a helmet and this giant Gatling gun. And he had bought an old police car and tricked it out to say the zombie hunter. And he would take the car and his costume and go to parades, to festivals, to community events as this kind of fantastical character he created.
The zombie hunter vehicle by itself was quite telling, almost like he enjoyed being law enforcement.
He would take pictures with police officers, sheriff's deputies, almost like he was the good guy fighting the bad guys.
I just remember looking at that photo and I'm like, he's hiding in plain sight. He's right there. He's taunting us.
After 2 decades, investigators in Phoenix, Arizona believe they've finally identified the elusive canal killer. 42-year-old cosplayer and self-styled zombie hunter, Bryan Patrick Miller.
Our team was excited. The proof is in the pudding, so to speak. It's going to be with his DNA.
To obtain a sample of Miller's DNA, one of Hillman's detectives comes up with a clever ruse.
He worked at a distribution facility on the west side of town. The plan was for him to go introduce himself to Bryan in the distribution facility parking lot, say, hey, I work next door. There's been a lot of retail theft going on. I noticed you like law enforcement. Can I hire you to be kind of eyes and ears, security out here to watch this place? Bryan took the bait. They arranged a meeting at a restaurant on the north side of town. We had it all set up. Bryan shows up, though, with his daughter. Huge curveball, because now we had to watch whose DNA is which and who eats what and that kind of thing. I think he drank just a couple sips and leaves, and we were wondering, did we get the DNA?
The glass is sent to the lab for analysis.
About 2 weeks later, and my phone starts to ring, and it's the DNA supervisor. She said, you did it. Bryan Miller's your guy. I can remember that day. I think people, they got up, they hugged, they just pure, raw emotion in the room.
On January 13th, 2015, Miller is arrested.
So in that early 90s area, you were in the Phoenix area. You know which bike trails I'm talking about?
I didn't like taking the trails along the canal. Those always scared me. That's why I didn't take them.
You live in the Phoenix area, and do you remember hearing any news articles about any ladies being killed?
Probably saw a few.
There's some DNA evidence that kind of links you to those girls. Is there any way you can explain that to me?
I don't see how that's possible. Why didn't kill anyone?
When investigators talk to Miller's family, His daughter isn't able to tell them much, but his ex-wife drops a bombshell.
She told us some troubling stuff about their sex life. Particularly, he would bring a knife and carve on her and lick the blood.
He began to engage in violent role play that disturbed her and led to the end of their marriage.
Miller's ex-wife agrees to testify against him when his murder trial begins in 2022.
She basically told us that she was frightened of Bryan, that she was just so afraid that she just kind of walked away and checked out.
With the DNA evidence and supporting testimony, prosecutors believe they have enough evidence to convict Miller. Instead of arguing that Miller did not kill Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis, the defense insists he was not responsible for his actions.
In psychology, they say, genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger. Bryan faced a difficult childhood. He was abused by his mother.
There were awful things that were described, including her threatening to cut off his penis and hitting him with the belt buckle part of a belt and forcing him to watch violent movies. The defense attorney basically laid out this idea that there were two different Bryans, almost like he had an evil twin, and he couldn't control what the other Bryan did.
The prosecution's experts don't agree.
Eroticized violence could be linked somehow to a misunderstanding of how to express affection as somebody matures or progresses through adolescence, but that in no way explains the violent acts committed by Bryan Patrick Miller.
On April 11, 2023, the court returns its verdict.
Bryan was found guilty of count of murder each for each of the girls, kidnapping and attempt sexual assault for both girls.
Miller's attorneys ask for life imprisonment. Instead, the judge sentences him to death.
I've seen a lot of murder in my days as a police officer, but this was truly over-the-top evil.
This is our version of Jack the Ripper. That you had victims who were horribly murdered and nobody knew who had done it. He instilled a lot of fear in a lot of people.
There is the Bryan that I know, and then there is the Bryan that did these heinous things. And you can't put them together. They're two very different personas. They're two different people. Like a light switched off in his brain somewhere, and now he's this serial killer.
Angela and Melanie both had bright futures ahead of them. Angela had a great job. Melanie was soon to graduate high school. I think we have to remember that they were important people in our community that were taken far too soon.
We want her to be remembered as just a loving friend, an adventurous, caring soul. To me, there's no excuse. I mean, to me, he's an evil man. A monster.
The Trotter Chronicles: From Gold to Grit, a novelization by Gemini. Prologue: The Man in the Sharp Suit. The air in the office was thick with the scent of expensive mahogany and the faint, clinical aroma of high-end air purifiers. Justin, a man whose skin looked like it had been buffed by a professional at a Swiss spa, leaned back in his leather chair. He adjusted his glasses, looking at the two men sitting across from him. One of them, Derek Delboy Trotter, was a man who looked like he belonged in a very different kind of office one with a calendar of a local garage on the wall and the lingering smell of cigar smoke, and hopeful desperation. Dell was dressed in what he considered his business best, a suit that shimmered just a bit too much under the fluorescent lights, and enough gold jewelry to make a pirate blush. Next to him sat Rodney, younger, leaner, and perpetually looking like he had just realized he'd left the oven on at home. Rodney was sweating, not the confident sweat of an athlete, but the cold, clammy moisture of a man who knew his brother was about to say something that would embarrass them both for the next century. "I've got all the basic details about your business career," Justin began, his voice smooth and devoid of any Peckham grit. "But what I'd like to do is to get an insight into the real you. How you started, how you became so successful, but more importantly, your lives and your raison d'etre." Del Boy's eyes lit up. He didn't know what a raison d'etre was, but it sounded French, and in Del's world, French meant class. "Oh, no," Del whispered to Rodney, "laboratory Garney." Rodney closed his eyes and prayed for the floor to open. "It's not laboratory Garney, Del," he hissed. "He's asking for our reason for being." "Exactly what I said. Prove," Del snapped back, before turning to Justin with a smile that could sell ice to an Eskimo and then charge him for the delivery. "Well, Justin, where shall I start? Up to a few years ago, we were just very ordinary people living. Well, very ordinary lives, weren't we, Rodney? And so the story began. A story of a watch found in a garage, a fortune made in an instant, and a fall so spectacular it made the Hindenburg look like a minor fender bender. Chapter 1, The Caribbean Dream. The sun over Barbados didn't just shine, it announced itself. It turned the turquoise water into a sheet of diamonds and the white sand into something so bright it hurt to look at without designer sunglasses, which, of course, the trotters were wearing. Only a few months prior, the trotters had been living in a council flat in Peckham, wondering if the hooky VCers they were selling would last through the first reel of Rambo. Then came the watch, an 18th century Harrison marine chronometer hidden in their garage for decades. It had sold at Sotheby's for £6.5 million. In an instant, Derek Trotter, the man who once sold one-legged turkeys at Christmas, was a multimillionaire. "Look at this, Rodney," Del had said, leaning over the balcony of their private villa. He was holding a glass of something blue with a miniature umbrella in it. "Total luxury. This is what we were born for. Mange tout, Rodney, mange tout." Rodney was sitting in a hammock, trying to read a book on sociology, but failing because Cassandra kept applying sun cream to his back. "It's a bit much, isn't it, Del? I mean, 6 months ago we were sharing a bathroom with a leak that Uncle Albert called characterful. Characterful. It was a health hazard." Del laughed. "But look at us now. We've divvied the dosh up. We made sure Uncle Albert got a nice little drink, figuratively speaking, though knowing him. He's probably literally drinking most of it down on the coast with Elsie Partridge. They had been the kings of the island. They donated to charity mostly because Dell liked the gala dinners, and they invested. Oh, how they invested. Dell had met a man in a bar. A visionary, Dell called him. A con artist, Rodney had countered. The man spoke of Central American markets, of vibrant ventures, and emerging economies. He spoke of turning millions into billions. It was a royal mint. Rodney, Dell shouted into the tropical wind. We were making money while we slept. But the Caribbean sun has a way of blinding you to the clouds on the horizon. Chapter 2. The Sound of the Crash. The end didn't come with a bang. It came with a phone call and a decline message on a credit card at a 5-star hotel. What do you mean? Insufficient funds. Dell had barked at the hotel manager, his gold rings clacking against the marble countertop. Do you know who I am? I'm Derek Trotter. I've got more money than the Sultan of Brunei's paperboy. The manager was polite but firm. The Central American market hadn't just dipped, it had evaporated. A coup, a currency collapse, and a series of creative accounting errors by their visionary friend had turned the Trotter fortune into a pile of worthless digital ash. Rodney, Dell whispered, his face turning a shade of gray that matched the London fog they had tried so hard to escape. The negotiations. They've collapsed. Collapsed. Rodney felt his stomach drop. Dell, we put everything into that venture. The houses, the stocks, the peacocks. I know, Dell said, his bravado finally cracking. We've even paid for this hotel on a credit card. A credit card which has now been withdrawn. The journey back to the UK was a blur of cramped airplane seats and the crushing realization that the dream was over. They weren't returning to a hero's welcome. They were returning to a financial wilderness. And it wasn't just them. Back in Peckham, the ripples of their failure were turning into waves. Michael Fisher, the landlord of the Nag's Head and a man who had trusted Dell with his life savings, was now behind bars. He had remortgaged the pub to follow the Trotter gold mine, and when it collapsed, he had tried to recoup the losses by embezzling from the brewery. He was a desperate man, and Dell felt the weight of every brick in Mike's prison cell. Chapter 3. The Court of Peckham. The corridors of the courthouse felt like a tomb. Denzel, a man whose nerves were usually held together by habit and hope, was pacing so fast he was nearly burning a hole in the linoleum. Denzel, sit down, Albert's voice echoed. Denzel stopped and looked at the group gathered. There was Trigger, looking as vacant as a Sunday morning in a library. There was Boyke, looking smug despite the circumstances. And there was Sid, the cafe owner, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I can't, Albert, Denzel groaned. I've never been a character witness before. I'm worried. I think Dole's made a terrible mistake. having us for here. It's like inviting the Manson family to dinner. Don't be so dramatic, Trigger said, staring at a fly on the wall. I'm going to tell them I hear voices. Trigger, you're not the one on trial, Denzel hissed. I know, Trigger replied simply, but I still hear voices. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even grimmer. The Inland Revenue was a beast that didn't care about mange tout or lovely jubbly. They wanted their pound of flesh, and they wanted it in sterling. Dell and Rodney stood before the judge. The properties were gone. The cars were gone. The peacocks had probably been repossessed by a very confused bailiff. Are there any mitigating circumstances? Their lawyer asked. Dell stepped forward, adjusting his tie. Oh, yes, you must remember to tell them that we were slaves to detail, wouldn't you? Rodney, we made certain that we always got our checks off to the Inland Revenue on time. Always, Rodney added, his voice cracking. Fair dues, Dell whispered as the judge looked down at them. They bounced, but they was always on time. The verdict was swift. Bankruptcy. They weren't going to prison, not yet, but they were being stripped of everything. The debt stood at $48,750 for pounds. It was a number that haunted those dreams. It wasn't just money, it was the price of his pride. Chapter 4, The Wrong Gentleman. Amidst the financial ruins, a personal tragedy struck. Uncle Albert, the man who had survived the Battle of the Atlantic only to be nearly killed by those cooking 1,000 times, had passed away. The funeral was a somber affair, or it should have been. The trotters arrived at the cemetery, faces long and hearts heavy. I feel bad, you know, Dell whispered to Rodney as they walked toward the open grave, leaving him here on his own while we was all off globe-trotting. He wasn't on his own, Dell, Rodney said. He had Elsie. He was happy. They stood by the grave, listening to the vicar speak of a man named Bunny who had served in the RAF. Bunny, Dell frowned. Why did he call him Bunny? Well, that's what they called him in the RAF, didn't they? A stranger next to them whispered, because his surname was Warren. Dell froze. He looked at the headstone. He looked at the grieving widow, who was definitely not Elsie Partridge. He looked at the photo of the deceased man who looked remarkably like Albert, but was missing the signature during the war beard. Rodney, Dell hissed, his eyes wide. Is that a Spitfire on the coffin? Yeah, Rodney whispered back. We're at the wrong funeral. They retreated with the quiet dignity of two men who had just realized they were mourning a complete stranger. It was the perfect metaphor for their lives, showing up with good intentions, only to realize they were in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong dead relative. Chapter 5, New Management. Back at Nelson Mandela House, the flat felt smaller than it used to. The wallpaper was peeling, and the ghost of their millionaire lifestyle lingered in the form of a single, half-empty bottle of expensive cognac. The firm's been liquidated, Rodney said, staring at the kitchen table. Trotter's Independent Traders is no more. It's caput. No, 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 Dell said, his mind racing. The firm can go on trading. It's just that I've been disqualified from running it. That doesn't mean to say I can't work for it. He looked at Rodney, really looked at him. We need a new managing director, Dell mused. Someone young, someone enthusiastic, someone full of ideas. Rodney looked around the room. Who? The window cleaner. No, Rodney, you. Rodney's jaw dropped. Me? Dell, I can't run a company. I can't even run a bath without getting a headache. Legally, there is nothing to stop you, Dell insisted. You're clean. No bankruptcy. No disqualification. You'd be the boss. Rodney Trotter, managing director. And so, the power dynamic shifted. Within days, the local paper carried a small advertisement, Trotter's Independent Traders, now under new management. Managing director, Rodney Trotter. Rodney took to the role with a terrifying level of seriousness. He started wearing a tie at breakfast. He spoke about executive stress and logistical paradigms. He even tried to listen to Mozart to unwind. Mozart's Symphony No. 38 in D major. Rodney explained to Trigger one evening in the flat. I find it helps me ease my executive stress. Trigger nodded slowly. Ain't there no words to this, Dave? No, Trigger, it's instrumental. Dell watched his brother with a mix of pride and annoyance. He was back in the game, even if he was technically just the staff. But the debt to the taxman still loomed. They needed a big score. They needed a miracle. And then the phone rang. Chapter 6, The Gold Rush. The studio lights were blinding. Jonathan Ross, a man who seemed to be made of charisma and expensive hair products, smiled at the camera. Welcome to Gold Rush, he announced, the fastest game show on TV. This is the show where you can win anything from £1 to 100,000 pounds. In the contestant's seat sat Derek Trotter. He had lied about his hobbies, claiming to love 16th century Italian Renaissance art instead of seeing what fell off the back of a lorry. And he had navigated the early rounds with the cunning of a street fox. He reached the final stages. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knockoff Swiss Army knife. For 50,000 pounds, Derek, Jonathan Ross said, leaning in. Which classical guitarist wrote the opera The Child and the Enchantment? Was it Ravel, Segovia, or Rodrigo? Dell felt the sweat prickling under his shimmery suit. He knew this, or he thought he knew it, but his brain was a jumble of French phrases and Peckham market prices. I'm going to have to use me old SOS, aren't I? Dell said, his voice trembling. I'll call my brother, Rodney. Back at the flat, Rodney and Cassandra were dressed in their fantasy therapy outfits, Rodney as a gladiator and Cassandra as a police officer. It was supposed to be a quiet night of memory baggage unloading. The phone screamed. Hello, Rodney snapped, assuming it was their annoying neighbor, Mickey Pierce. Piss off, Mickey, you're getting on my tits now. Rodney, it's Jonathan Ross. The silence that followed was deafening. Rodney realized he had just told one of the most famous men in Britain to piss off. Rodney, we need your help, Jonathan said, hurried. Derek is on 25,000, going for 50. Which classical guitarist wrote the opera The Child and The Enchantment? Was it Ravel, Segovia, or Rodrigo? Rodney didn't hesitate. He had to GCEs. He had been listening to Mozart for a week. He was an executive. Ravel, Rodney said with absolute certainty. 100%. Del, it's Ravel. Del turned back to the camera, his chest puffed out. I'll go with that. Jonathan, it's Ravel. Jonathan Ross looked at him with a face full of pity. Derek, that was the wrong answer. It was Rodrigo. The world seemed to stop spinning. Del's face went through every shade of red known to man. He had lost it all. Again. On national television. Chapter 7, The Phoenix of Peckham. The silence in the flat that night was heavy. Del sat on the sofa, still wearing his game show suit, staring at the floor. Raquel was in the kitchen, and Rodney was hiding in his room, probably trying to find a way to dismantle his gladiator armor without making a sound. The phone rang. If that's Mickey Pierce, Del growled, picking it up. I'm going to murder him. Hello, is this Derek Trotter? A voice asked. It sounded professional. This is the producer of Gold Rush. Del rolled his eyes. Oh, give it a rest, Mickey. I can hear the jukebox in the Nag's Head from here. No, Mr. Trotter. This is serious. We've made a mistake. Our researchers checked the facts. Ravel did write the music for The Child and The Enchantment. Even though he's a composer and not primarily a guitarist, the question was flawed. Del sat up straight. A mistake. You mean? I was right? You were right. We're offering you the 50,000 pounds, or the chance to come back and play for the 100,000. Del looked at the room. He looked at Rodney, who had peeked his head out of the bedroom door. He looked at Raquel, who was standing in the doorway with hope in her eyes. Give all the money to charity. Del shouted into the phone, his old bravado returning in a rush of adrenaline. And if you phone here once again, I'm going to come down there and kick your arse into shredded duck. Goodbye. He slammed the phone down. Del, Rodney screamed. What are you doing? That was 50 grand. Del started to laugh, a deep, wheezing Peckham laugh. It was Mickey Pierce, Rodney. I could hear the jukebox. He thought he could wind me up, but nobody winds up Derek Trotter. He stood up, adjusting his cuffs. We're the Trotters, Rodney. We don't need charity. We're back in business. New management, new ideas, this time next year. Rodney sighed, but he couldn't help but smile. We'll be millionaires? No, Del said, throwing an arm around his brother's shoulder. This time next year, we'll be debt free. And that, Rodney, is bonjour. It's bonjour, Del, Rodney corrected. Exactly what I said. Prove exactly what I said. The neon sign of the Nag's Head flickered in the distance, a beacon of hope in the heart of Peckham. The Trotters were down, but they were never out. Because as long as there was a deal to be made and a brother to blame, the dream would never die. Chapter 8. The Cold Light of Day. The following morning did not bring the clarity Del Boy had hoped for. Instead, it brought a pounding headache and the lingering suspicion that he might have made a catastrophic tactical error. He sat at the formica table in the kitchen, nursing a mug of tea that was mostly sugar. Rodney stumbled in, looking disheveled. Del, Rodney said, his voice flat. I've been thinking about that phone call last night. Forget it, Rodney. Del snapped. Mickey Pierce, professional wind-up merchant, probably recorded the whole thing to play at the pub later. Low D toilet. Rodney. Water under the bridge. Del, I went to the pub this morning to get some milk because the fridge is on the blink again. And Mickey Pierce was there. He looked as miserable as a rainy Tuesday in Margate. Apparently, his latest business venture selling laser-cut toast just failed. He didn't even have enough credit on his phone to make a prank call. Del froze, his mug halfway to his lips. What? And there's more. Sid showed me the morning paper. There's a small headline on page 12. Game show blunder. BBC apologizes to Peckham contestant over classical music gaffe. The silence in the kitchen was heavy. You could hear the distant rumble of the 171 bus and the slow, rhythmic dripping of the leaky tap. So, Del whispered, his voice barely audible. It wasn't Nicky. It was the producer. Del, you told the BBC to give £50,000 to charity in the name of the Trotters. Del Boy put his mug down. He stared at the wall, at the framed picture of their mother. Well, he said, his voice suddenly bright and brittle. At least we'll get a plaque or a mention in the newsletter. It's tax deductible, ain't it? We don't pay tax. Del, we're bankrupt, Rodney shouted. Details, Rodney, details. Del stood up, pacing the small kitchen. This is just a temporary setback. A minor hiccup in the grand tapestry of Trotter fortunes. We're under new management. Remember, Managing Director Rodney Trotter. What's our first move, boss? Rodney looked at the pile of unpaid bills on the counter. Our first move is to find something to sell. Something that doesn't involve the Sultan of Brunei or the BBC. Chapter 9, The Electronic Revolution. Rodney's first official act as managing director was to meet with Monkey Harris. Monkey was a man who lived up to his name short, agile, and always looking for a way to climb a bit higher on the social ladder. He met Rodney in the back of a van parked behind the Nag's Head. "I've got a consignment," Rodney, Monkey whispered, opening a cardboard box. "Electronic personal organizers. Top of the range. They tell the time, store 500 names, and have a built-in calculator. They're selling like crazy in the West End." Rodney picked one up. It was a sleek, black plastic device that looked like something from a low-budget sci-fi movie. "How much?" "For you. A tenner apiece. I've got 200 of them." Rodney calculated. 200 at 10 pounds was 2,000. If they sold them for 30, that was for 1,000 pounds profit. It wasn't 50,000, but it was a start. "I'll take them," Rodney said, trying to sound executive. "But I'll need to pay in installments. Cash flow. You understand?" Monkey nodded. "I understand. Cash flow is the soul of business. I'll drop them off at Nelson Mandela House tonight." When Rodney returned to the flat, he found Del Boy trying to fix the washing machine with a bent coat hanger. "Good news, Del. I've secured our first inventory. Electronic personal organizers. The future of business. We're going to modernize Peckham, one address book at a time." Del looked at the device. "Electronic organizers. People round here can barely organize a trip to the toilet. Rodney, who's going to buy these?" "Everyone. Busy professionals, students, anyone who needs to stay on top of their game. It's executive stress management. Del, der chic." Del said, his eyes narrowing. "They look a bit plastic. Are they waterproof?" "Why would they need to be waterproof?" "In case it rains on the market stall. Rodney, think avoirdupois." Chapter 10. Iconoclastic Autosuggestion. While the business world was being revolutionized by plastic organizers, the domestic world of the Trotters was entering the realm of fantasy therapy. Cassandra had insisted. After the stress of the bankruptcy and the game show disaster, she felt their relationship needed a reboot. She had found a book by an American psychologist who spoke of memory baggage and the need to create our own make-believe world. Iconoclastic autosuggestion. Rodney explained to Del Boy while they were sorting the organizers. It's about rejecting reality and becoming different people, just for an evening. Sounds like what I've been doing for 40 years. Rodney, Del quipped. What's the catch? We write down our fantasy figures, and then we become them. No dressing up. It's all in the mind. But as with everything in the Trotter household, the no dressing up rule was the first to go. Thursday night arrived. Del had agreed to take Raquel and Damien out to see a film, giving Rodney and Cassandra the flat to themselves. Or so Rodney thought. I'm taking them to see that new cartoon, Del said, adjusting his coat. The one about the singing fish. We'll be back late. Enjoy your Autosuggestion. Rodney waited until the door closed. He went to his bedroom and emerged 10 minutes later wearing a leather skirt, a plastic chest plate, and sandals. He looked like he had been rejected from a high school production of Spartacus. Cassandra emerged from the bathroom. She was wearing a police uniform, complete with a hat and a plastic truncheon. "Rodney," she gasped. "I thought we said no dressing up." "I couldn't help it. Cass, the book said to fully immerse yourself. I'm Russell Crowe in Gladiator. And well, I'm a detective from the Bill." Cassandra sighed. "You look different." "Strength and honor, Cassandra," Rodney said, striking a pose that nearly caused his chest plate to pop off. "Now, let us unload our baggage." They sat on the sofa, trying to be reborn, but the atmosphere was somewhat dampened by the smell of those lingering cigar smoke and the faint sound of the neighbors' heavy metal music. So, Rodney began, trying to deepen his voice. "On my signal, unleash the feelings. Rodney, I don't feel like a detective. I feel like an idiot. That's just the memory baggage talking. Reject it. You are an officer of the law. I am a hero of Rome." Suddenly, the front door burst open. "We're back," Del Boy shouted, stumbling in with Raquel and Damien. The cinema was full. Apparently, every kid in Peckham wants to see a singing fish. He stopped dead. He looked at Rodney. He looked at Cassandra. "Oh, my God," Del whispered, his eyes widening. "Rodney, what have you done to her? Is she arresting you?" "It's therapy, Del," Rodney hissed, trying to hide behind a cushion. "Go away." "Therapy? You look like you're about to fight a lion in a police station." Del started to laugh. A deep, wheezing sound. "Raquel, come and see this. Russell Crowe and the Bill are having a meeting in our front room." The fantasy was officially over. Reality hadn't just returned, it had kicked the door down and started laughing at them. Chapter 11, The Sultan's Shadow. A few days later, the executive stress was reaching a fever pitch. Marketers in Peckham were apparently resistant to digital organization. Rodney was sitting at the kitchen table, Mozart playing softly in the background, when the phone rang. Trotter's Independent Traders, Managing Director Rodney Trotter speaking, he said, trying to sound bored and important. "Good evening," a voice said with a thick, exotic accent. "I am wishing to speak with Managing Director." Rodney's eyes narrowed. "This is he. Who is calling?" "My name is Asif Hazen. I am representative of Sultan of Brunei." Rodney rolled his eyes. He looked at Delboy, who was pretending to read the paper but was clearly listening. "The Sultan of Brunei," Rodney repeated loudly. "Well, how can I be of assistance, sir?" "His Highness has seen your advertisement in the newspaper. He is very impressed with your party planning and consultancy." "Is he now?" Rodney smirked. And what does His Highness want? Does he want me to fly out and organize a palace warming? Exactly. He wants you to fly to Brunei. All expenses paid. He has bought a crappy old three-wheeled van, and he wants to know where to start it on cold mornings. Rodney's smirk vanished. He slammed the phone down. Shove it, Mickey, he yelled at the dead line. Just shove it. What happened? Del asked, looking up. Dave's just had a big row with the Sultan of Brunei. It was Mickey Pierce. Del, I could hear the jukebox. He thinks he's so clever, using an accent. But as Rodney sat back down, his Mozart symphony reached a crescendo. He looked at the advertisement he had placed. He had listed consultancy and party planning. It was a professional advert. He looked at the phone. For a fleeting second, he wondered, what if the Sultan of Brunei really did have an old van? What if he really did need a consultant from Peckham? Del, Rodney whispered, do you think? Don't worry, Rodney, Del said, patting him on the shoulder. The world's full of surprises. Look at Nicky Pierce, he's only just learned to read. They sat in the quiet flat to brothers bound by blood, bankruptcy, and a never-ending cycle of nearly and almost. They were back where they started, in Nelson Mandela House, with a mountain of debt and a box of plastic organizers. But as the neon sign of the Nags had flickered outside, Del Boy looked at his brother. This time next year, Rodney, he said, the old spark returning to his eyes. This time next year, we'll have sold all them organizers. We'll be back on top. Mange tout, Rodney, mange tout. And in the heart of Peckham, that was enough. Chapter 12, The Ghost of Mickey Pierce. The weight of the charity call hung over the flat like a thick London fog that refused to lift. Del Boy tried to carry himself with his usual swagger, but every time he passed a television, he felt a phantom pain in his wallet. 50,000 pounds gone with a single, ego-driven outburst. I could have bought a new van. Rodney, Del whispered, staring into his lukewarm tea. A yellow one, with leather seats, and a heater that actually works. You gave it away, Del, Rodney said, not looking up from his latest business management book. You wanted to look like a big man. Well, congratulations. You're the biggest man in the soup kitchen. Rodney was trying to embrace his role as managing director, but the reality of the market stall was far from the corporate boardrooms he envisioned. The electronic organizers were currently sitting in the hallway, taking up space and gathering dust. We need a marketing strategy, Del, Rodney announced, standing up. We can't just stand on a street corner and shout. We need to target the high-end demographic of Peckham. Del snorted. The high-end demographic of Peckham is anyone who's still got all their own teeth. Rodney, just get M down to the market. I'll do the patter. No, I'm the MD. I'll do the patter. You can be the logistics coordinator. The what? Rodney, I've been selling since you were in nappies. I could sell a no-entry sign to a getaway driver. But Rodney was insistent. He wanted to prove he was more than just a bone marrow donor in a cheap suit. He spent the evening practicing his executive voice, much to Raquel's amusement and Dul's irritation. The next morning, the market was bustling. Rodney stood behind the stall, looking stiff and uncomfortable in a trench coat he thought looked professional. Del stood to the side, arms folded, waiting for the inevitable. "Step right up, ladies and gentlemen," Rodney shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Experience the future of personal management. The Trotter 3000 electronic organizer. Stores 500 names. Calculates, tells the time in Tokyo." A woman in a headscarf stopped and looked at the black plastic device. "Does it tell me when the 171 bus is coming?" "Well, no," Rodney stammered. "But it can store the bus timetable if you type it in." "I can't type," she said, moving on. "And I don't know anyone in Tokyo." Del Boy stepped forward, unable to restrain himself any longer. "Oi, darling, come back. Don't listen to him. He's just the apprentice. Look at this, it's not just an organizer. It's a status symbol. It shows the world you're a person of substance. And look at doubles as a very stylish paperweight for your betting slips." He grabbed one and held it high. "Normally 30 quid, but today, because my brother here has just been released from a psychiatric institute, and I'm feeling sorry for him, 15 quid, for 25. Within 10 minutes, Del had sold 3. Rodney watched in a mixture of awe and resentment. The executive dream was slipping away, replaced by the familiar grit of the Peckham hustle. Chapter 13, The Road Sweepers Union. As the weeks dragged on, the organizers sold in drips and drabs. But the mountain of debt to the inland revenue remained immovable. The threat of bailiffs was no longer a distant worry. It was a looming shadow that darkened every conversation. "Raquel's right, Del," Rodney said one evening, looking defeated. "Trigger said they're recruiting down at the depot. Road sweeping. The pay is steady." Del Boy looked like he had been slapped. "Road sweeping. Me, Derek Trotter, the man who once had peacocks on his lawn. I'm a trader, Rodney, an entrepreneur. You're a bankrupt entrepreneur. Del, we need money, real money, not this time next year money." Del looked around the flat. He saw the peeling wallpaper, the half-empty bottles, and the tired look in Raquel's eyes. The bravado he had worn like armor for decades was finally starting to rust. "I'll help you fill in the form," Rodney offered, his voice softening. "Me?" Del shouted. "I wasn't talking about me. You're the one who needs a job. You're young. You're fit. You can push a broom from here to Lewisham." "I'm the managing director," Rodney protested. "Exactly. And part of managing a company is diversifying your income streams. Now, Go on, get the pen, and see if they've got any vacancies for a logistics consultant with his own high-vis vest. The tension in the flat was broken by a knock at the door. It was Trigger. "All right, Dave," Trigger said, nodding to Rodney. "It's Rodney, Trigger." "Yeah, whatever. Del, I heard you were looking for a bit of work. My supervisor says he's got a spot on the night shift. It's mostly quiet. Just you and the broom. Gives you plenty of time to hear the voices." Del Boy closed his eyes. The image of himself in an orange vest, sweeping up kebab wrappers at 3 a.m., was the final indignity. "Thanks, Trig," Del said, his voice surprisingly quiet. I'll think about it." After Trigger left, Del sat by the window, looking out at the estate. He thought about the watch, the millions, the Barbados sun. It all felt like a dream someone else had dreamt. Rodney, Del said, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Did I really tell them to give that 50 grand to charity?" "You did. Del, you were brilliant. The whole country thinks you're a saint." Del smiled, a small, sad flick of the lips. "A saint with no shoes, eh? Well, at least I'm a saint. Say lavi, Rodney. Say lavi." Chapter 14, The Final Word. The interview with Justin was drawing to a close. The high-end office felt even more alien now that the story had been told. The mahogany desk seemed colder, the air purifiers more sterile. Justin adjusted his glasses, scribbling a final note in his leather-bound notebook. "It's a fascinating journey, Mr. Trotter, from the heights of sudden wealth to the current situation. But tell me, do you regret it? The watch, the investment, the charity call?" Del Boy leaned forward. The gold on his fingers caught the light. He looked at Rodney, then back at Justin. "Regret it," Del said, his voice regaining its familiar resonance. "Justin, my son, life is like a market stall. Sometimes you're selling silk, and sometimes you're selling scrap. But the point is, you're always in the game." Rodney shifted in his seat, looking at his brother with a mix of exasperation and pride. "We had the world in our hands for a minute," Del continued. "And yeah, we dropped it. But we're trotters. We're like those little rubber balls you get in the 50p machines. The harder you hit us against the pavement, the higher we bounce." He stood up, smoothing his shimmering suit. "I've got a warehouse full of electronic organizers that are going to revolutionize the world of personal management. I've got a managing director who's got more ideas than a patent office. And I've got a family that, well, they're the only thing that's actually worth $6.5 million. Justin stood up, offering his hand. "Thank you, Derek. It's been an insight. I'll be in touch." As they walked out of the office and into the cool London air, Rodney turned to Del. "So, what now, MD?" Del Boy looked at the yellow Capri parked at the curb. It was old, it was battered, but it was theirs. "Now, Rodney, Dell said, his eyes sparkling with a new scheme. Now we go to the nag's head. I think I know a bloke who's looking for 200 slightly water-damaged electronic organizers. He's a Lap's laptop salesman, and I think he's a fan of Ravel. Rodney sighed, shaking his head. You never learn, do you? Learn? Rodney, my boy, if I learned, I'd be bored. Mange tout, Rodney, mange tout. And as they drove off into the Peckham sunset, the neon sign of the Nag's Head flickered to life, welcoming them back to the only world they truly understood. Chapter 15, The Nag's Head Debrief. The Nag's Head was exactly as they had left it, dimly lit, smelling of stale lager and failed dreams, and populated by the usual suspects. Sid was behind the bar, looking as if he'd personally invented misery, while Trigger sat in his usual corner, nursing a half pint of something that looked like swamp water. Del Boy burst through the doors, his shimmering suit reflecting the flickering neon lights. Behind him, Rodney followed, looking like a man who had just survived a high-stakes interrogation which, in a way, he had. "A round for my friends, Sid," Del shouted, slapping a 5-pound note onto the counter. "And make 'em large ones. We've just been to the top of the mountain and come back with the view." Sid didn't look up from his glass polishing. "The mountain? Last I heard, you were at the bottom of a bankruptcy hole. Del, that 5-pound note wouldn't even buy you a ticket out of Peckham." "Details, Sid, details." Del laughed, grabbing to brandies. He walked over to Trigger. "All right. Trig, you missed it. We just had a meeting with a high-flying biographer. He wanted the inside scoop on the Trotter Empire." Trigger nodded slowly, his eyes vacant. "Did he ask about the voices?" Del: "No, Trig, he didn't. But he was very impressed with our raison d'etre." "Your what?" "Our reason for being," Trig, Rodney intervened, sitting down. "Not that Del actually knows what it means." "I know exactly what it means, Rodney," Del snapped. "It means we're still here, ain't we? Against all the odds. The taxman, the game shows, the Sultan of Brunei, they've all tried to knock us down. But we're like a pair of bad pennies." Boyke walked into the pub then, looking as smug as a man who had just sold a rusty tractor for the price of a Ferrari. Ah, the Trotter brothers, back from the financial wilderness. "I see. I hear you've been disqualified from running companies. Derek, a bit of a choker, that." "Not disqualified, Boyke," Del said, leaning back. "Under new management, meet the managing director of Trotter's Independent Traders, Rodney Trotter, esque." Boyke let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Rodney, running a company, I've seen more business acumen in a damp sponge. What's the first item on the agenda, Rodney? A national shortage of lanky idiots?" Rodney went red. "Actually, Boyke, we've just secured a major consignment of high-end electronic personal organizers. We're modernizing the Peckham retail sector. Electronic organizers. Boyke sneered. My dog has better organization than anyone in this pub. Who's going to buy them? People with ambition. Boyke, Dell said, his eyes narrowing. People like you. Tell you what, since we're old mates, I'll let you have a dozen for a special insider price. Think of the prestige. I'll think of the bankruptcy court. Derek, Boyke said, turning away. Enjoy your empire. Chapter 16, The Executive Lunch. Monday morning arrived with the relentless grayness of a Peckham winter. Rodney, now fully committed to his role as managing director, decided it was time to establish a new corporate culture. This involved an executive lunch with Cassandra at the local Italian restaurant, though his expense account was currently a handful of loose change and a half-punched loyalty card for the kebab shop. It's about prestige, Cassandra, Rodney explained as they sat at a table with a checked cloth that hadn't been washed since the 70s. A managing director needs to be seen in the right places. It builds confidence. Cassandra looked at her menu, then at Rodney's trench coat. Rodney, we're in a cafe that calls spaghetti Italian noodles, and you're bankrupt. Maybe confidence isn't what we should be building right now. Maybe we should be building a savings account. We will, once the organizers start moving. Dell says he's found a niche market. The niche market being people who don't realize they're being ripped off. Rodney sighed. You have no faith. Cass, this is the new Trotter era. No more hooky gear. No more midnight runs. We're going legit. Suddenly, the door burst open and Del Boy walked in, looking frantic. He was carrying a cardboard box that was leaking a mysterious, dark fluid. Rodney, thank God I found you. Del panted, sliding into the booth next to them. The organizers, we've got a problem. What problem? Rodney's executive comm shattered. The warehouse. Well, when I say warehouse, I mean the shed behind the nag's head. It had a bit of a leak, and the waterproof boxes. Well, they weren't. Rodney looked at the box. The dark fluid was soaking into the tablecloth. Del, are they ruined? Not ruined. Just seasoned. I've spoken to a bloke who says if we leave them in a warm oven for 20 minutes, they'll be as good as new. But we need a warm oven, and ours is currently being used by Raquel to dry the laundry. Cassandra put her head in her hands. The new legit era. It lasted exactly 45 minutes. It's a minor setback, Del insisted, grabbing a breadstick. I've already started the remarketing. The Trotter 3000. Now with added humidity sensors. It's a feature. Rodney, people pay extra for features. Chapter 17, The Skip of Destiny. While Rodney was dealing with the damp organizers, Del Boy was on the hunt for a new opportunity. This usually involved driving the yellow Capri around the back streets of Peckham. looking for skips that looked promising. You never know what people throw away. Raquel, Dell said as he poked her on a large metal container outside a derelict office building. One man's rubbish is another man's. Well, another man's profit margin. He pulled out a tangled mess of copper wire and a dusty, ornate frame that looked like it belonged in a haunted house. Look at this. It's a genuine Victorian. Something, probably priceless. Dell, it's a broken picture frame with dry rot, Raquel said, staying in the van, and it's covered in pigeon droppings. Character, Raquel. It's called patina. People in the West End pay thousands for patina. I'll get Rodney to research it. He's the MD now. He needs to earn his keep. Back at the flat, Rodney was staring at the copper wire. Dell, this isn't an opportunity. This is theft from a demolition site. It's recycling. Rodney, we're being green. We're saving the planet while we save the family firm. Now, look at this frame. What does it say to you? Rodney looked at the crumbling wood. It says tetanus, Dell. No, it says heritage. I want you to go down to the library and find out if any famous painters lived in this area. If we can link this frame to, say, Constable or Turner, well, bonjour, Rodney. We're back in the millions. Dell, Constable painted Haywains in Suffolk, not tower blocks in Peckham. Maybe he had a holiday home here. Just look it up. And while you're at it, see if you can find out how much scrap copper is going for. I've got a feeling our luck is about to change. Chapter 18, Trigger's Wisdom. Late that night, Dell found himself back at the Nag's Head. Rodney had gone home to argue with Cassandra about the ethics of scrap metal, and Raquel was busy with Damien. Dell needed a sympathetic ear, and as usual, Trigger was the only one available. Trig, Dell said, staring into his brandy. Do you think I'm a failure? I mean, look at me. Bankrupt. Sweeping roads mentally. If not literally yet. Managing director of a company that's currently storing damp address books in a kitchen oven. Trigger blinked slowly. I don't think you're a failure. Dell, you've got a nice suit. It's polyester, Trig. It sparkles because of the static. I like the sparkles, Trigger said. But you know what I think? I think life is like a broom. You can have the same broom for 20 years. You just have to change the head and the handle every now and then. Dell looked at him. Trig, that's the same broom. You've just replaced all the parts. Exactly, Trigger said, looking satisfied. And that's you, Dell. You've replaced your houses, your cars, your money, but you're still the same broom. You just keep sweeping. Dell let out a long, shaky breath. You know, Trig, for a man who hears voices. You make a lot of sense sometimes. I am the broom, and Peckham is my warehouse. Do you want to know what the voices said today, Dell? Not really, Trig. They said ravel, just the one word. over and over again. Del stiffened. Ravel. Why ravel? I don't know, Trigger said, finishing his drink. Maybe they like his shoes. Del sat in the silence of the pub, the word ravel echoing in his mind. Was it a sign, a curse, or just the ghost of a 50,000-pound mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life? Chapter 19, The Organizer Meltdown. The oven drying experiment was, perhaps unsurprisingly, a catastrophe. Rodney had left the Trotter 3000s in the oven for exactly 20 minutes, as Del had instructed. What Del hadn't mentioned was that the oven shouldn't be set to max. When Rodney opened the oven door, a cloud of acrid, black smoke billowed out, filling the flat. "My organizers," Rodney screamed, waving a tea towel. "They're melting. Del, they're literally melting together." Del Boy ran into the kitchen, coughing. Oh, bloody hell. It's a modern art installation. Quick, Rodney, get a photo. We can sell it as a commentary on the digital age. It's not art, Del. It's 2,000 pounds of debt turning into a plastic pancake. The smell was unbearable. Raquel came in, holding her nose. What in God's name is going on? The neighbors are calling the fire brigade. It's a technical glitch, Raquel, Del shouted. A minor manufacturing defect, Rodney. Stop crying and get the spatulas. We might be able to save a few of the calculators. They spent the next 3 hours scraping melted plastic off the oven racks, out of the 200 organizers. Only 3 survived, Dan, even those only worked if you held them at a 45-degree angle and shouted at them in Japanese. Well, Del said, looking at the small pile of charred plastic, at least we've still got the scrap copper. The scrap copper that you found in a skip, Rodney whispered, his voice broken. The copper that's currently sitting in the hallway smelling like dead pigeons? It's a start, Rodney. An entrepreneur always starts small. We'll go down the yard tomorrow. We'll get a few quid. We'll buy a lottery ticket. And before you know it. Don't say it, Del, Rodney groaned. Just don't say it. Chapter 20, The Midnight Sweep. The final indignity arrived at 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. Del Boy, dressed in a high-visibility vest that was several sizes too large, stood on a deserted street corner in Peckham. In his hand was a heavy, industrial broom. Trigger was next to him, looking perfectly at home. It's a good shift, this one. Del, not many people around to bother you. Just the wind and the wrappers. Del looked down at his broom. He thought about the silk shirts, the gold-leafed villas, and the sound of the Sotheby's gavel. He thought about the millions he had held in his hand, and the way it had slipped through his fingers like sand. Trig, Del said, his voice barely a whisper. How did I end up here? You walked, Del, from the flat. It's only 10 minutes. Del smiled. He started to sweep. The rhythmic sound of the bristles against the pavement was strangely soothing. He swept up a discarded lottery ticket, a crushed beer can, and a crumpled newspaper. You know what, Trig, Dell said, his spirits beginning to rise. This isn't so bad. It's honest work, and it gives me time to think, to plan, to strategize. Strategize what, Dell? The next big one, Trig. I've been thinking about those singing fish. If we can find a supplier who makes 'em with a built-in organizer. Well, mange tout, Trig, mange tout. Trigger nodded. I like fish. And there, in the quiet streets of Peckham, under the flickering orange glow of the streetlights, Derek Trotter began his comeback. He wasn't a millionaire anymore. He was a bankrupt road sweeper with a melted plastic dream and a skipful of copper wire. But as the first light of dawn began to touch the top of Nelson Mandela House, Del Boy looked at the horizon and winked. Because the Trotters were back. And this time, they meant business. Chapter 21, The Efficiency of the Broom. Morning brought a new kind of fatigue, the kind that settles into your marrow and stays there. Del Boy sat at the Formica table, his orange high-vis vest draped over the back of the chair like a discarded superhero cape. Rodney was already up, surrounded by sheets of graph paper and a calculator that was missing its zero button. I've worked it out, Del, Rodney announced, tapping a pencil against his teeth. Route optimization. If you sweep the main estate in a concentric spiral starting from the central play area, you can cut 3 miles off your shift and improve debris collection by 14%. Dell looked at him with bloodshot eyes. Rodney, I'm a road sweeper, not a Mars rover. The debris collection is already optimized by the wind. It all ends up in front of the Nag's Head anyway. That's the problem. You're reactive. Del, you need to be proactive. Managing director's orders. We're going to run this cleaning operation like a Swiss watch. Del snorted, reaching for a piece of cold toast. Swiss watch? More like a sundial in a coal cellar. My back is killing me. Rodney. And Trigger keeps talking to the pigeons. He thinks they're working for the council. Well, maybe they are. Information is power. Del. The tension was broken by the sound of a heavy box being dropped in the hallway. It was Monkey Harris, looking suspicious as usual. I've got M. Rodney. Monkey shouted from the hall. The aquatic prototypes, straight from the factory in Shenzhen, or maybe a shed in Croydon, the labels were a bit blurry. Del pushed himself up. Interest finally peaked. The singing fish. Singing fish. Monkey pulled a sample from the box. It was a rubbery, green bass mounted on a plaque. It looked like it had been through a car wash on the wrong setting. These are the limited editions. Del, they don't just sing, they tell jokes. Del pressed a button on the base. The fish flicked its tail, opened its mouth, and in a high-pitched, metallic voice, squeaked. Why did the salmon cross the road? To get to the other. Air 400 for. Rodney looked horrified. It's broken. It's not broken. Rodney, Dell shouted, his eyes sparkling with a new scheme. It's a cliffhanger. It's an interactive comedy experience. People love a mystery. We'll sell in as philosophical fish. They make you think. Chapter 22, The Aquatic Opportunity. By the end of the week, the Trotter Flat was a sanctuary for 200 rubbery fish that occasionally burst into snippets of "Don't worry, be happy" in the middle of the night. Rodney had developed a marketing plan involving premium executive office decor, while Dell had a more direct approach, the back of the Capri. Prestige is all well and good, Rodney, Dell said as they loaded the boxes into the van. But the people of Peckham don't want prestige. They want something to annoy their neighbors with. And these fish are the nuclear option. Dell, we're supposed to be going legit. We can't sell faulty fish from a van. It's a violation of the Trotter Independent Traders' new corporate charter. The charter is under review, Rodney. Now,